Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. My name is Valérie Piet. I'm the director of the International Observatory of Human Rights, and it's a very great pleasure to be here. Today is very important for us. We are here as guests of the UN, and we are here in partnership with Press Emblem, who have been very gracious to partner with us on this event. This meeting is for the process of the Universal Review on Turkey. The discussions that you will hear today on press freedom and also on human rights defenders are part of the submissions that have already been made for the event that will take place tomorrow. We want to deal in fact, we want to deal in looking at all of the different points that have been raised, because it's a very important time. We sit at a time where we see press freedom with no improvement within Turkey. We see press defenders suffering in Turkey. We are an independent body. We are not here on a political platform of any point. It is on this day where, within the UN, we sit 75 years since its birth. Today is the anniversary of the Holocaust, and I'd like to acknowledge that as well. It is also 25 years since Srebrenica in Bosnia. I'm very glad to have Ambassador Stephen Rapp as our keynote speaker today. I introduce Ambassador Rapp not only as the former US ambassador for war crimes, but also as a fellow of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Center for Prevention on Genocide. I raise this not because I think there is genocide happening in Turkey. I raise it because certainly within Bosnia, we sat back and we did not pay attention to the erosion of rule of law. So we are very short of time today. I would ask you please to keep any questions till the end of the session, but I would like to pass immediately on to Ambassador Rapp. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for being here today. You heard me referred to as an ambassador and someone also representing the U.S. Holocaust Museum. The reason I became an ambassador 6 years ago under President Obama and served in that role as an ambassador at large for global criminal justice was because of my background as an international prosecutor, prosecuting in Rwanda, for the ICTR, prosecuting as the chief prosecutor in West Africa for the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And I understand that puts me in mind always of crimes and very serious ones. One of the major cases that I prosecuted at the Rwanda Tribunal involved the media, involved RTLM, aka Hate Radio, and Kangura newspaper. And in a very long and complicated 34-month trial, the principals of those organizations were convicted of direct and public incitement to genocide. That was frankly a case in which we had the support of journalists around the world, including Reporters Without Borders, because it was such a serious case of expression being used to incite horrendous violence. Here in Geneva, of course, we're dealing not with criminal law, we're dealing with human rights law, and dealing with violations there as well, but violations that are not always crimes. And during the coming weeks and tomorrow with Turkey, using this process of the Universal Periodic Review to basically encourage states to improve their records when it comes to the protection of human rights under various international treaties and conventions. And in dealing with Turkey, we have to keep in mind that here is a country, a very important one in the world, and one that can change, and can change for the better. Unfortunately, since 2010 and the first cycle of the Universal Periodic Review, it's gone entirely backwards. But we see a democracy in Turkey. We see the election, admittedly rerun, but with an even stronger result the second time in Istanbul. But at the same time, we've got this control on independent journalism, on the courts, all of which makes the exercise of democracy so much more difficult. The Committee for the Protection of Journalists last year said that Turkey was the world's worst jailer of journalists. Now, that says something, because there are a lot of countries whose human rights records are even worse, and where journalists are tortured to death, not detained for long periods, and eventually released under restrictions, which often happens in Turkey. But it's in part because of this desire, it's really self-evident, to prevent sort of criticism of the government, to prevent the citizens from having accurate information about what their government is doing. And that's the only way in which democracy works in the end. And if you can stop that, those that want to maintain and retain and expand their powers are much more able to do that. In that regard, the situation, as I said, does not appear to be getting better. I mean, sometimes you see positive things. In 2018, the state of emergency was lifted. It didn't seem to have any effect, however, on these cases being pursued. And in September, we had a decision of the High Court, the Court of Cassation, releasing 7 journalists. But still, we continue to have a prosecution of journalists and more than 100 detained and others under restriction. And the independence of the judiciary, which is so critical to having cases properly decided, isn't well protected under the 2017 Constitution. Indeed, the president has a much larger role in selecting judicially, politically favorable journalists or politically favorable judges and prosecutors to handle cases. And of course, we've had prosecution of many judges and lawyers and prosecutors for whatever reason to remove them from the system. Turkey makes promises, as they have in the prior UPR cycles, but frankly hasn't kept them. Now, the particular reason that it's able to prosecute journalists isn't because it's following careful laws like we did at the international level on the incitement to genocide by RT&LM. They're using very broad anti-terrorism statutes in which it becomes extremely easy to convict people, and they even have this law on acting as essentially coherently, essentially doing something or taking the same view as some terrorist organization on a particular political issue. And of course, that can always happen in a society, that it can appear that you're agreeing with one side or another, whether you agree with them or even approve of them. You may agree on a public issue. And so these kinds of laws are used to profoundly restrict freedom of expression. And of course, we've got efforts as well to control the online space. That brings me to the case that I was involved in specifically in the Turkish judicial system, and not the most serious, I should note, because many journalists have faced long periods of detention and imprisonment, and this particular one didn't. But it was the case that I was asked to evaluate for the Trial Watch program, which was started by the Clooney Foundation and Columbia Law School, was the case of the People versus Kansu Pishkin, and a case of an online journalist who was prosecuted under a specific terror law. And as this process of trial monitoring works, there were people who attended the trial each day, who made careful notes, which were translated into English. I don't speak Turkish. And also obtained all of the documents involved in the trial. And I looked at it, and it was an intriguing case to me, because I'm familiar with situations of North Korea or Syria or other places where justice happens entirely behind closed doors, and where cases are made on tortured confessions and other abuses like that occur. This was frankly a case where she had opportunity to prepare. She was given several adjournments. She had counsel. It was a very polite courtroom. It was public. But indeed, every argument that was made, no matter how meritorious, was basically knocked down without any explanation. And a judgment was reached that frankly wasn't supported by the facts or even by the letter of the law. Specifically, the case involved a rather interesting one in terms of the context of conflict in the region, but indirectly a group of students at, what in translation is Bosphorus University, were protesting the incursion by Turkish forces into Syria, the operation that took the area around Afrin. And they were handing out, rather clever protest, Turkish delights, but labeling them as Afrin delights. That profoundly angered the regime. And they were arrested, detained for a long period of time. And then the prosecutor on the case was replaced by an individual who had made political statements in the past, including a political statement that the People's Democratic Party, which is, of course, a peaceful party that represents areas of Kurdish population, is not a PKK-allied party at all. But this particular individual, who was the prosecutor, had said that the party, the People's Democratic Party, was doing the bidding of a terrorist organization. And this particular reporter, in her online publication, Evrensel, published the fact that he'd been assigned as prosecutor and provided the quotes that were from the public record on what he had said in the past. And for that, she was charged for disclosing the name of a public prosecutor. Well, I've been a public prosecutor in my own country, been a public prosecutor at the international level. I never dreamed that my name could be at all a secret. An officer seeking to employ the process of justice, and certainly there was nothing in the court record that made the prosecutor's role a secret, and the name of the prosecutor and his assignment had been disclosed in Takvim and other mainline journalist organs. But the argument here was that by disclosing it and talking about his position, somehow he was then being targeted for a terrorist attack, and that was her intent in doing it. Well, that, of course, was a specific intent crime of the kind like we have for incitement to genocide. I've got to prove that they intended a genocide. Now, how do you do that? You can't read somebody's mind. You have to show their prior writings. You have to show their course of conduct. You have to show their support of violence. You have to show a lot of other things if you're going to prove intent through other kinds of evidence. Well, they didn't have any of that, so the prosecutor dropped the case. And then a judge of the High Court said, when somebody tried to bring it again in the High Court, you can't bring it because it's now time barred. But they brought it again in the terrorism court, and nonetheless proceeded with this trial, and had no evidence ever presented of her specific intent, no confronting of the fact that the case was time barred, and eventually she was sentenced to 10 months in prison, but suspended in return for giving up a right of appeal and to going under probation for a period of 5 years, during which all of her publications would be monitored. So I gave the trial a D. I mean, there are worse trials in the world, but certainly one that's clearly politically motivated. And as the OSCE Special Rapporteur said, this sort of disposition of putting someone under control in terms of their writings and reportings is also a suspect thing. Nothing wrong with probation with reasonable conditions, but a condition like this really is a red flag that what's being done is to restrain free expression. Well, this is the kind of challenge that one faces in Turkey, and we're going to hear speakers who are going to talk about cases that are much more serious than this one. We're also, and later in the session, going to be talking about how human rights defenders are also being persecuted in an effort to prevent the exercise of human rights in Turkey. I did want to say one final thing, and I say this advisedly, but I say it only because of my own past experience as a criminal prosecutor, and because international human rights and human rights treaties do have extraterritorial application. Sometimes in my own country you hear that contested, but my good friend Harold Coe, our legal advisor, put that to rest in 2013. So I'm worried about what Turkey might do in Syria. and not do in Syria. And that also involves questions of international human rights obligations. And there, of course, the issue upon which the students were demonstrating that led to the prosecution, that led to Cansu's unfair conviction, is quite relevant. And that includes, of course, the recent incursion of Turkish forces into northern Syria to create this 20-mile enclave. And allegations that ethnic cleansing could be taking place, not necessarily by Turkish forces, but by allied forces with jihadi backgrounds. I think it's extremely important that as we deal with this complicated situation in Syria, and I won't get into it, but that the message be delivered loud and clear to the Turkish state, that having gone in there as they did, and having been allied with certain forces, that they have a profound responsibility to make sure that human rights are not violated by anyone that they're working with. I mentioned my work in Rwanda, but I also prosecuted in West Africa and Sierra Leone and convicted Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, who never set foot in Sierra Leone, but for aiding and abetting the action of the RUF rebels, which were famous for murder and rape and child soldiers and chopping off hands, etc., because he aided and abetted what they had done, enabled their doing that crime. And so I certainly encourage, obviously we want to see peace in Syria, we want to see refugees returned, we want to see everything done in a proper way, but we also want to prevent violent abuses conducted by anybody else, and that if there are those actions, as have been alleged to have occurred in Afrin beforehand, and now we have some 200,000 people displaced, and the UN say about 120,000 have returned, so 80,000 are afraid to return. We just have to make sure that actions that would violate the most serious human rights, the right to life and physical integrity, aren't violated, and the obligation on Turkey is to prevent or punish any actions that might be committed by any of their forces or their allies. Thank you very much for your time today, and I'll be glad to answer questions later. Sorry to go on as long as I did, but these are extremely serious issues. I don't want to indicate for a minute that the issue of press freedom isn't an absolutely paramount one, because without the facts being disclosed, without the truth being available, while the messengers are suppressed, it's impossible for democracy to work. It's possible for governments to be held accountable, and for that reason, this jailing of journalists, this use and overuse of the terrorism statutes has to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rapp. That was perfect. We are here to discuss the universal review of Turkey. We are among very many NGOs and organizations who have submitted for that event. Our submission was about press freedom, and we did that with the London Advocacy Group and with Press Emblem. So our first session here today is on press freedom, and I'd like to invite MEP from the UK, who sadly is shortly to be no longer an MEP this week, Ms. Irina von Wiese, who is going to moderate this session on press freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm really honored to be speaking to you here on what is my last week, sadly, as Vice Chair of the Human Rights Subcommittee in the European Parliament. I think we're going to start without further ado. We're running slightly behind schedule. Turkey, once an aspiring member of the European Union, unfortunately today features high on the list of human rights urgencies and indeed the agenda of my subcommittee. According to Reporters Without Borders, Turkey is the world's biggest and worst jailer of professional journalists. Detained journalists and closed media outlets are denied any effective legal recourse. The rule of law is a fading memory in the new Turkey of paramount presidential authority. Censorship of websites and online social media has reached unprecedented levels and the authorities are now trying to bring online video services also under control. With me here to discuss these issues are some very distinguished guests from the world of law and journalism. So first of all, we have Barış Altıntaş, who is a journalist and blogger. She's based in Istanbul and civil society professional. Between 2005 and 2015, Barış worked at various mainstream news publication outlets in Ankara and Istanbul, covering politics, science, and women's rights. An Ankara native, she graduated from the Middle East Technical University with a Bachelor of Science in Political Sciences. After graduation, she moved to St. Petersburg, attending an international relations program at the St. Petersburg University. She's a co-founder and currently co-director of the Istanbul-based Media and Law Studies Association, which provides legal, advocacy, and professional support to journalists and freedom of expression lawyers. Welcome. Secondly, we have Yazuz Baydar, who is editor-in-chief of Ahval, a trilingual independent online news site in Turkey. He has been a journalist for nearly 40 years. Baydar was among the co-founders in 2013 of the independent media platform P24 to monitor the media sector and the state of journalism in his home country. He has lived outside Turkey in exile since the July 2016 coup attempt. His opinion articles have appeared in The Guardian, Süddeutsche Zeitung, New York Times, El País, Svenska Dagbladet, Yomiuri Shimbun, The Arab Weekly, and Index on Censorship. And finally, we welcome Massimo Frigo, who is Senior Legal Advisor for International Commission for Jurists. Massimo is an international and comparative law expert with particular focus on migration, counterterrorism, criminal justice, accountability and access to effective remedies and reparations, and the independence of the judiciary and legal profession. Massimo joined the ICJ in 2007 in the Global Security and Rule of Law Program, the Business and Human Rights Program, and Legal and Policy Office. He has been for many years the editor of the ICJ e-Bulletin on Counterterrorism and Human Rights. Prior to joining the ICJ, he assisted in the research of the International Council on Human Rights Policy. Massimo holds an LLM of the University of London and a law degree of the University of Trento. Welcome. So maybe if I can start off with a question. Given the ongoing hostility for journalists in Turkey, how can the international media community work to improve the situation for journalists there? Maybe, Yazuz, you would like to start? Thank you.
Well, thank you for this, and thank you for the introduction. I just want to make a small addition. So about our organization, yes, we do give legal support to journalists, but currently we represent 56 people, 6 of whom are in prison. And just to, give my credentials, and then I'm a journalist, but I'm also a half lawyer now. As well, the ambassador just drew a very good, picture of the situation in Turkey. And currently we have 96 journalists in prison, or more than 100, according to some lists. The number is not important. Take any list you will, and Turkey will be the worst jailer, as the ambassador said. And for what we're seeing is absolutely baseless charges of usually terrorism. And like in the case of Cansu Pişkin, take Cansu Pişkin's case, that was the case that the ambassador talked about as part of Trial Watch's justice monitoring efforts, and multiply it by 100. And during the, because I don't have much time, I'm not going to give more examples, but I can and I will during the maybe, if the opportunity rises up during the question and answer session. So I'm going to highlight 2 points that are the biggest obstacles in the way of journalists and independent journalism, and just to give you a very short summary of what these are going to be, is about not the legislative situation, but the implementation and how that relates to the problem of independence of judiciary. And secondly, the recent attacks on internet freedoms. So again, the keynote speech was so good. I just don't want to be repeating it. But so yes, the state of emergency was lifted in 2018, but it was placed by a presidential system where there are absolutely no checks and balances. And which has brought about basically, or accelerated the complete erosion of law, which is what the journalists are facing now. Recently, Turkey introduced judicial reforms that would supposedly prevent lengthy pretrial detentions or pretrial detention for freedom of expression. And again, these the broad definitions of anti-terrorism law. The first thing I want to say is that you do not need to change, you do not to adopt any reform packages to release people right now. If Turkey only implemented its current code of criminal procedures that is in place, none of these people would be in jail for reporting, for tweeting, or for freedom of expression. And I don't know if that's going to come up in the country recommendations, but we link this to the structure of the Council of Judges and Prosecutors. So this council decides everything about judges and prosecutors. They're like gods for them, basically. Your salary, which court you're going to serve in, your possible dismissal or promotion, all depends on this council. We call it the HSK. And half of this body, that has 12 members, half of this body are appointed by the president, which is, President Erdogan, obviously. And the other half are appointed by the party that has a majority in parliament, which is President Erdogan's party, AKP, which basically brings us to a place, even if you have well-meaning judges. And we have seen this a lot in many trials. They are not going to rule in any way different than what the government wants. We have seen time and again in the question and answer session, we might give more concrete examples where journalists were released according to the law, Turkey's own domestic law, according to the European Court case law, but only to be replaced, the next day by new judges, and their release decisions being overturned. And additionally, judges who knowingly ignore international legal standards, including those that Turkey's party to, have been rewarded. An example of this would be the Cumhuriyet case, which was an absolutely baseless indictment where the judge gave very severe convictions to journalists where the evidence was only their expression. Actually, it was that they were accused of changing the editorial policy of the newspaper, and he was then appointed as a judge to a high court at the end of this process. So this new judicial package does not address this, the lack of checks and balances in this. There have been recommendations, even in the brief for this panel we're holding. Yes, legislative changes are absolutely necessary, but implementation will remain a big problem as long as judges stay slaves to the system and HSK. And as long as we don't have an independent judiciary, we're not going to we're going to have journalists being blocked, because in Turkey, people are not really deterred. The number one reason why we have so many journalists in prison is because people are not afraid. They're going to continue writing. But the court system not being independent remains as a big problem. The second one is that I'm going to talk about, this internet censorship in Turkey. Again, now people will continue to write. People are continuing to write their not that they don't mind, but they're not really afraid to go to prison. But when you cut off that one final space, internet, then that is a big issue, because that's when you can't, that is the problem, you can't get out the news. And again, in the recommendations for, in this panel, we talked about law number 5651, which gives basically the initiative to 3 bodies. These are the BTK, the Communications, the Information Technology Council, the Union of Access Providers, who are companies that are internet access providers, and thirdly, which brings again us back to the judiciary, the judgeships of criminal peace. So they decide, and we're seeing a lot of arbitrary mechanisms in which none of these 3 actually bodies are even involved. So what we understand, we've seen examples of this, is any website can be just shut down by a phone call, and then it takes years, as in the case of Wikipedia, to basically undo this. You have to go through a long court process up until the Constitutional Court, and if your news report is banned, just even this link, it will take you somewhere from 2 to 3 years to lift that ban if you can go through this process. And in response to the question about what international community can do, so I think international community has been very responsive in the case of some big and popular names. In the case of journalists, we think this is a problem. It's understandable that they will have some symbol names, but what we're seeing is that unfortunately pressure and interest seems to wane after some names or some hostages are released. For example, Deniz Yücel was released, but that doesn't mean we no longer have journalists in prison. The fact very much stays so, and it is increasing, or that the fact that Wikipedia, the ban on Wikipedia was lifted doesn't mean that internet censorship has ended. It's continuing, and I just want to say one last word about this recent effort to put streaming websites on under the control of RTÜK, the Supreme Board of Television and Radio. And we see this, we're extremely concerned about this, and we see it as a major threat to journalism, because the way the wording of the law, and we've taken this to administrative judiciary, and we're waiting for a response, is the way it is worded is that it's not very clear what those streaming videos are. So the argument was that, they want Netflix to pay its taxes, or the platforms. No, the way this is worded, it could be used for anybody, for anyone. It could be your own Facebook video, or it could be just two Kurdish journalists coming together, starting a website. They could very well easily fall under this legislation. Also, a second, and this was not in the law, but this is in the directive that with this RTÜK law, is that you need to obtain a license. And to obtain a license, you need to go through vetting of the National Intelligence Agency, which of course is going to deny, for example, back to our example of Kurdish journalists. Secondly, you don't have to ask for permission of the state to report the news. This is a major violation, and the law allows that. And thirdly, one major problem is that this license fee is about 100,000 lira, which is going to be impossible for most people. If it is, we're going to see how it's going to be implemented, but if it's implemented for ordinary journalists who definitely now have the internet as the only platform where they are, and it's going to be impossible for people to gain this license, and there could be terrible results for journalism and for the people's right to information. We're extremely concerned about it, and I just want everybody to understand that implementation, yes, legislative changes are very much necessary, but implementation is key. And as long as we have this HSK system in place, this is not going to happen. So we do really encourage NGOs, countries to keep this in mind in their interactions. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Altıntaş. Can I pass the word to Mr. Baydar? How did we get to this point, and where are we going from here?
Okay. Hello. I address you all with a sense of profound fatigue after 41 years in journalism, because operating as a journalist in Turkey is not an easy business. And things have never been rosy in Turkey. There have been some bright moments, but overall, in the 80s, 90s, we had the problems, huge problems facing the censorship, oppression, all these punitive measures. But things have turned really, truly south lately. The duty of public intellectual or journalist is to call a spade a spade. I think we should face the facts, call really spade a spade in terms of what's happened since Gezi Park protests approximately, which corresponds to the report that we are going to be listening to tomorrow and discussing. This period has been a period of really a total eclipse, I would say. If we look at the situation since 2013, summer after Gezi Park protests. Now, as of now, you know, the duty of journalists is to always to question the structures of power, whatever they are, critically reporting and informing the public whenever necessary with the critical viewpoints. Now, we are facing a situation where the power structure in Turkey is turned into a full-scale, nearly full-scale security state, or some say police state, which has all sorts of related components within it these days. And the exercise of severe internal security measures, extreme centralization of power, the violence sponsored by the state actors and their supporters, brutality often bordering into or going beyond irrationality, and widespread fear as a result, all speak for such a term, security state or police state. And national security has become a paranoid obsession these days, and constant invention of domestic enemies, including journalists, a routine practice. Parliament is open, yet acts as a rubber stamp office, toothless. As a result of the referendum, 2017, April 16, which gave President Erdogan superpowers, Parliament has lost much of its role to enact upon checks and balances, which are no longer. Rule of law no longer applies. Let's call spade a spade. It doesn't apply anymore. The oppressive practices and punitive measures over the past 5 years or since 2013 have shown that basic rights and freedoms written in the Constitution are unprotected, including even the right to property. People no longer, we monitor the people, no longer trust the justice system. In opposition segments, people whose rights are stripped off are treated as pariahs, as living dead, as scapegoats, as the eternally condemned. Everything's arbitrary, more or less. The judiciary, which was always a problematic part of Turkish Republic's administrations, like the media sector, over the decades, always polluted by the political interferences, has undergone its most dramatic purge following the botched coup 2016, followed by state of emergency, and only later to be subordinated by the palace. It's now extension of the political executive. Transformation is comparable only to what happened to the judiciaries of Germany or Soviet Russia during the 1930s. So media, the fourth estate, the judiciary gone, parliament toothless, political executive controlling everything. The fourth estate, the media is now under the yoke of presidential palace administration. The palace controls nearly 94% of the media sector, according to assessments done by IPI and I believe Reporters Without Borders and other international bodies. We have seen many examples of a univocal mouthpiece media as a collective manipulation apparatus, which would even make Goebbels convulse with envy. So one can no longer really speak about, if we have to face the truth, of a fourth estate as we know it. So what, as a summary, time is scarce, so I will be brief, what are these oppressive patterns of oppressive measures that we have been seeing in the Turkish, regarding the Turkish journalism? First and foremost, as mentioned by the ambassador and my friend Barış here, this most visible component of the punitive measures is, of course, the jailing of journalists. And approximately 150 of our colleagues, some of them even up to 4 or 5 years behind bars, are going through a burden, a torment that makes us really horrified of what's next. Jail, along with jail, the prosecutions endlessly flowing in, of course, having chilling effects. One journalist, moving from one courtroom to the other, spending his or her time that usually she or he would devote to informing the public are spent in those courtrooms where most of the prosecutions, I would say up to 98%, are basically ridiculous, Orwellian or Kafkaesque. And irrationality has thus become a norm in those. But of course, it has a chilling effect. Jailings have horrified people, as well as endless number of prosecutions. The second pattern, punitive pattern, is regarding not only individual journalists, and this has evolved into a systematic way of dealing or dismantling the conventional media structures, is by way of law and business. State of emergency following the coup brought the practice of closing down, not only jailing journalists or chasing them out, closing down media outlets from different segments or inclinations of the Turkish media, nearly 200 of them, be them Kurdish, be them affiliated with Gülenists or Gülen movement, or be them leftists or Alevi affiliated. All this diversity that is necessary for any journalism to thrive, along with the independence and freedom, diversity or pluralism is more or less gone as a result. So institutions being attacked, and none of these outlets have been reopened. More so, they are being targeted more and more. And the rest, which are left without this type of harassment of closures or takeovers by the state or trustees, have been transferred to the pro-government or loyal, palace-loyal businessmen or business people or families. As a result, this 94%, this is like a univocal, the huge machinery of propaganda, every day facing massive amount of fake news and unbiased sort of reporting and propaganda type of commentary. Then you have the third pattern, which has been established and systematized not only by state of emergency, but also by the change of regime by way of referendum, 16th of April 2017. These administrative measures are topped by the establishment of Directorate of Communications tied to the presidential palace. And it's now operating as almost the main only bulk to monitor daily, hourly, and censor the media. This control mechanism is what prompts me to say making comparisons to the 1930s. TV channels are newspapers, as we know it, are being daily directives or warnings by this directorate, either to come out with joint or identical headlines, or whenever they fail or do something bad, they are warned. Second one of the administration processes, as I think touched by one of the speakers, is the issue of press cards. Press cards have always been a blurred part of the Turkish media system because part of the decision-making mechanism has always been the state, the Prime Ministry's information center or directorate. This was abolished with the change of the regime in 2017, and thereby the mechanism of joint decision-making of issuing press cards, together with the Turkish Journalists Association, which is the largest professional organization in Turkey, have evaporated. These jurisdictions were given to the Directorate of Presidential Palace as the only authority to decide who is a journalist or not. I personally opposed always this press card because I don't want any state involvement or government involvement in whoever issues the press card. Nobody can decide who is whether no state or power structure can decide whether I'm a journalist or not. In democracies, unions or associations, professional associations do that in UK or Germany, etc. But anyhow, this is causing a huge trouble for our colleagues in the alternative media, feeling lost and feeling targeted in this. Third one is, of course, the public advertisements, which are now being cut off radically from the alternative media as they now cry foul more and every day. Then digital media, as Barış pointed out, 2019 data prepared by Professor Yamanakdeniz and his team speak about 54,000 websites banned along with 160,000 URL addresses. This is one of the top levels of banning worldwide. Of the 54,000 websites being banned, more or less 22% are gambling sites, etc., etc. But in the rest, many news sites, passing thousands, are banned. Those are alternative media. I'm almost there. Kurdish and leftist websites at home or abroad, independent websites like Özgürüz, whose editor-in-chief is Can Dündar, my colleague and friend in Germany, or my website, Ahval, are banned, as well as many other websites abroad as well, covering Turkey. So, what is left after this 2013 up to now? The TV channels are gone. For the autocrats, the most feared channel, medium is the TV, because in Russia, in Turkey, all these, or Egypt, people watch TV mainly. They don't buy newspapers. Rural areas don't have so much access to digital. So almost all the TV channels are now under the direct or indirect control of the palace. Newspapers, print journalism, tiny ones, with the exception of a few, very few, are toothless because their circulation numbers are only counted in 2,000, 3,000, with the exception of only one secular nationalist newspaper, Sözcü, which is about 300,000. Circulations have collapsed altogether. 3 years ago, total circulation number was 5 million in Turkey. Now it is 1.8 million of the newspapers, national newspapers. And unemployment is rising, of course, as you can imagine, due to firings and the financial hardship. And the tiny 7% of the media sector struggling to inform the public have immense difficulties. Law, financial, etc. So this is leaving the Turkish public with a huge blackout. Many people don't know what is going on really in the country. And of course, this is coupled with the lack of proper minimum public discourse, because most of these TV channels, which would be informing public with the debates, etc., are not allowing critical voices or objective voices. So taboos are also are updated. Now we are having several. Earlier it was the Armenian genocide, which was the taboo, which is no longer, but it is replaced by president and his family. Corruption. This is the taboo number one. The second one has come back, the Kurdish issue. It's another taboo. And I would leave it there because this is what leaves us rather helpless in the period following the Gezi Park protests. And what we cling to is of course, hoping that the young generations having vital access to and willingness to have access to digital media, social media, etc. Therein, we see some flickers of light. Otherwise, most of it is buried in darkness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baydar. Patterns that ring all too familiar. Unfortunately, we all know where they lead in other police states. Mr. Frigo, has democracy failed the Turkish people?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for also inviting the International Commission of Jurists to give a testimony of the situation in Turkey. I think the intervention who preceded me already answered a bit the question, and actually the fact that you invited the International Commission of Jurists, who's an international non-governmental organization that since 1952 across the world protects and promotes the rule of law and human rights. It's a bit part of the answer that Turkey now is, unfortunately, the tragic example of the fact that when the rule of law fails, the protection of human rights, and in this case of freedom of expression or freedom of the press, fails together with it. When we attack the antibodies, the checks and balances of human rights law, which are independent courts and an independent legal profession, we allow for the substance of human rights actually to perish. And this is unfortunately the problem we find in the country now. We have been working for several years across the world, but also on the situation of Turkey. And you have heard it from the previous presentation. There are long-standing problems in terms of the legal framework of the rule of law in Turkey, and more recent ones. The long-standing problems is the anti-terrorism frameworks, these anti-terrorism legislation which are broadly framed. Basically, you can consider terrorism any practices, and this has been used in the last decade, we're not talking only about the last years, to actually frame as terrorist practices and opposing views that were not in pleasure. And this is really a responsibility that goes back to previous governments as well. So we have really a structural problem of having offenses of terrorist propaganda, which frankly are unheard of. A wide extension of what is membership to a terrorist organization, which usually is triggered by behaviors which in other countries will never qualify for this offense. So these are long-term things which we have seen and demand reform. Another point is what we have seen since the attempted failed coup of 2016. There we have seen really the erosion of the building, of the structures of the judiciary, which is there to protect the rights of the people and implement them. So what we have seen immediately was the immediate arbitrary sacking of 1/3 of the entire judiciary. Imagine a country where 1/3 of the judiciary immediately sent home. And then in the year that followed, around 2,000 judges have at the moment or the other been subject to a deprivation of liberty, whether for police custody or actually for an entire prosecution. We have seen, and this has been explained, the constitutional reform of 2017, which has brought the self-government body of the judiciary entirely to be appointed by the parliament and the president, which is against the European standards of independence of the judiciary, and effectively deprives the entire judiciary from the structures that protects individual judges to promote their independence. If the body controlling your disciplinary system, your work, your transfer, your appointment is not formed in an independent manner, you will always fear for your career, for your safety at work, and therefore it's difficult to have an inner independence as a judge with those structures. So these are two key reforms that have actually impaired the work of free journalism in the country. And another one, which again comes before the attempted coup, which was the institution of the judgeship of the peace, which has been mentioned, which have both power on authorization of deprivation of liberty, but also powers on the internet, on the closing of websites. This is a peculiar measure. It was a measure presented to make more efficient the system. And here we find individual judges that are responsible to authorize these measures. And when you appeal against them, you appeal to the judge with the office just beside them. So you actually don't appeal to a superior court, which may be in a different office. You appeal to the person sitting just beside them, like I would appeal to the ambassador. At its face, the system is structurally problematic. And these are the kinds of structural issues that creates the difficulty to actually hold the independence of the judiciary and to protect human rights through that. So how can we protect the rights of journalists to speak freely when they cannot find a protector of their rights in courts and in lawyers, because lawyers have been arrested as well. And scholars, we haven't spoken about academic scholars who have been massively dismissed. This is a structural problem which even the European Court of Human Rights, which is rather slow, I may say, to deal with the issue, in the last ruling on the Osman Kavala case, when they assessed even the indictment of the case, they said, we usually don't even read the indictment, but there's nothing there. How could it be possible that the person is still in jail? He says, I've never read a decision like that. It is quite peculiar of the fact that at this moment, we have a judicial system in Turkey that needs to find the structural independence back again, and this requires enormous and constitutional reforms. And also we need individual judges to start really to retake the role, even if it's a great risk. But the problem is that the rule of law is at the heart of the protection of human rights. And it would be impossible in any country and in Turkey to get independent free journalism if we don't give an independent judiciary and an independent legal profession. Thank you very much.
Very much, Mr. Frigo. I'm afraid we're running out of time. I would, however, like to give Ambassador Rapp the opportunity, maybe. No,
that's fine. We can at the end.
To comment at the end, maybe at the end, but please allow me to thank our speakers and particularly those who have taken considerable risk in coming here. So thank you, it's very much appreciated.